We're very excited to have with us Igor Kufayev. So Igor, I want to give you the floor. If you can tell us a little bit more about your life and your journey and how you got here and wherever else you want to share.
Sure. Well, very nice to be here, guys, with you all. Thank you for this opportunity, for this privilege to share. And I will perhaps give a very brief outline. If anything that catches your attention, you can maybe direct the conversation there. But yes, I was born in Uzbekistan at the time when it was still part of the Soviet Union, and had, I would say, normal upbringing of what would be considered for someone of my generation, which goes back to 60 years now, this very year. And very early on, I have developed interest in visual arts, and greatly contributed to that was my mother's, I would say, guidance, in the sense that he put me to a studio of a private artist who became my mentor. He wasn't just teaching us kids how to draw and paint, but it was a place of gathering of very interesting, charismatic people. So for a 12-year-old boy, I suddenly found myself surrounded in that otherwise quite a homogeneous upbringing, which maybe for some sound and look exotic, because I grew up in a predominantly Muslim country, in the old town of Tashkent, right? And with very kind of close to nature as well, right? On the outskirts, as boys, we would just like wander into the wild, right? I had my first 3 days stays in the mountains at approximately that same age of 12. And the mentorship that I received was, of course, not just about the visual arts from that age, but there were people who were interested in all this, what was still pretty much underground. There were these Buddhist practitioners, there were these people who were reading Nietzsche, right, German existentialists, and what have you not. Then my mentor's tragic death, he was killed in a brutal incident, even though he was, well, perhaps because he was a martial artist, he was an accomplished Kung Fu master, in addition to him being a painter and piano player. He's a very charismatic, beautiful man. His younger brother took me under his wing, who was also very kind of a persona non grata. And was introduced into this very, I was the only son to my mother, and growing up without a father. So there's very, very strong connection to my mother, no siblings. And suddenly I am thrusted into this very male, masculine company of people. He was also the brother of my mentor. He was friendly with the very well-known group of stuntmen from Moscow, from Mosfilm. So there was like richly famous stuntmen that would come to Uzbekistan to hang around there, and I've met all these people. And of course, growing up, this very kind of like a physically frail teenager, very quickly I was inspired to pick up all the dumbbells and all the kind of started physically tending to myself. And by my mid teens, I was already referred to by my let's say court kids on the street as Bruce Lee, because I was so like jacked. And so I'm saying this because all this will make itself important later on. And of course, there's great passion for art. I became student of art at the Department of Painting in the College of Art in Tashkent, graduated it with a diploma of a teacher, and was called to the military service, compulsory one, during the Afghanistan campaign. There was no exemptions made. So I've served 2 years in down there in the south. And after that, I've studied briefly at the Institute of Fine Arts at the mural painting department, and got transferred myself to St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Arts. So this kind of was a dream to come true, where I was able to really meet all the peers in the field. And approximately, if we are to fast forward a few years, not completing my studies, I moved to Warsaw. Also, my first daughter was born there. No, my second daughter, sorry, was born there in Warsaw. And I experimented with art independently from the academic studies. I was trying to catch up very quickly from all that, what I missed in my, let's say, day education, right, which was very classically based, classically in terms of like classical visual arts based on all the ideals of the Renaissance as the Soviet education would adopt into their curriculum when it comes to not just visual arts, and to many, many other forms of art, architecture, sculpture, theater even. So anyway, I find myself here experimenting and all that. And the great tragedy strikes our family. My firstborn child dies in a car accident back in Tashkent. And of course, this shook the entire family. My mother turns very religious, just literally overnight. And soon after, she finds her way to transcendental meditation, which started to recruit first people in the area when transcendental meditation was introduced, immediately upon the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We're talking about 1991. And that very same year, I find myself already in London on the invitation from 2 of my one-man shows in Warsaw. And I'm making this unknown to me face. I don't speak the language. It's all very new to me. And this tragedy completely knocks me down. I have no passport because the country I came from no longer exists. This literally happened after I entered the UK with that Soviet Union passport. And when I go to what then became a Russian embassy and tell them, like, what do I do? They're just like, we don't know. It's like a huge confusion, like, you know, like you no longer belong here. So I was in this limbo for quite a few years, unable to travel, kind of literally for 2 years without any papers, without any documents, and living through this trauma, which is a shared trauma, of course, in the family. And something really strongly happens in my field through the grieving and all that, which I'm trying to process and pour it all into art. So I'm trying to express myself through visual terms, through the medium of painting. My mother, in the meantime, starting to already write me a lot about the benefits of meditation, about the TM, and I'm feeling very resistant to that until I'm experiencing this sudden jolt, and the third vertebra goes out of place. And being athletic in every way, like all my life, right? When I came back from the military, I was like, you know, continue running, exercising, this and that. I was like really combining this art and real physical activity, which was, you know, always fills you with adrenaline and like testosterone and feeling great. And suddenly I cannot put socks in the morning. And agonizing weeks go by, having to go fix myself through chiropractic, and it just last day or two and back to normal. I mean, normal, back to square one with this real kind of disc sleep or whatever it was. So suddenly this all gets me trampolined into something I've never expected. I'm amidst of maybe most agonizing week at night, right, in a state of despondency, like trying to prop myself for sleep. I drift off to sleep, and in the middle of the night, my body just shook and kind of raised up. And I was very surprised because normally I wouldn't be able to do that movement with that lower back trauma. So, and that very moment I sit in that kind of disbelief and that half in between state, and I feel presence of something or someone, literally the presence of the otherworldly or whatever that may be. And don't get me wrong here, prior to that, even though I had tremendous, let's say, interest through the history of arts, and I started reading philosophy at a very early age. I forgot to mention that the brother of my original mentor introduced me to Søren Kierkegaard, and later to all these, let's say, German existentialists, from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche to later Camus, to all this, what can mess up any young head big time. But yet somehow I've managed to navigate through it all and just extracting what felt really fueling that imagination and life of a young painter. So I didn't become a nihilist, that's what I'm saying, right? I still loved life to bits. And this, other than that, I was pretty much atheistic in my understanding, in my interests. You know, philosophy that I read and was interested was not necessarily, oh yeah, and I arrived naturally to Martin Heidegger. So he was the last Western philosopher that I read at the time, already able to read him in English translations. And yet this experience, I'm about 28 years old, this experience at night and this presence then whispers or hums something into my top of my head. And that humming literally felt like mantra. And I had very just superficial notion or understanding of that at the time. It was just like, okay. And so that, whatever that was, session, transmission, whatever you may call it, ceased, my body falls back on bed, the pain returns, and I try to lull myself back to sleep. So in the morning when I wake up, of course, bewildered with that memory, still fresh in my mind, I crawl to the wall, prop myself up, and that was my first seating. I sat memorizing that what was breathed or hummed into the top of my head. And I continued with that for few more days, always getting some relief, at least from the acuity of pain, until in one of the sittings, my body went through a series of kind of like its own initiated movements with the sounds as if something is being, literally as if I'm on a table of the chiropractor. Click, 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 click. And all that pain literally went through my eyes, like exited, like all that pain went out. The relief was unbelievable. I was in tears. I was in a state of some kind of elation, of course. And so I've realized that indeed meditation is a magic. It's a pure magic. So my mother, well, before that, there was an encounter which I have spoken about a couple of times in my earlier interviews, and I've given a kind of also as close and as concise overview of that in the book that we've just published. when meditating in the company of two other meditators, I had this, my body was thrown into spontaneous spin. Just started to rotate from the base of the spine, and I could not do anything. I could not stop. And it was becoming more and more and more and more powerful. And of course, there was a lot of noise. I could see with the corners of my eyes that the two others, two other ladies that were, in my presence, both yoga teachers, by the way, qualified yoga teachers, one of them from the Kripalu lineage, they looked terrified. They were completely terrified, not knowing what to do. And it lasted however long it had to last until it is subsided, guided by that same very power that ignited it in the first place. I was feeling at once dizzy, blissed out, and at the same very time, everything kind of had this precision, and what I caught very distinctively, this acuity of that, what later, I did not have the language at the time, sense of presence. So now I can speak about it, obviously, but at the time, it was just all new to me. So on one hand, there was this sense of being literally blissed out in most orgasmic joy. And at the same time, and dizzy as well, like there's this dizziness from the sheer rotation that the body went through. There was this sense of everything has this, like as if windows of my perceptions were cleansed, as the poet says, right? That everything appeared as if in greater clarity, greater dimension. So of course it stayed with me, and not that experience stayed with me. No, what stayed with me is the memory of that unusual experience at the time. And my head started to sway by itself. Like as soon as I sit down, close my eyes, the head would just start swaying like this. If I try to stop it, it would start swaying again. And that went for a number of years, including when I went back to Uzbekistan and got initiated into TM now, because my mother said, okay, you've done it, or whatever done it, now you need to be laicized or introduced into the tradition proper. So she insisted almost lovingly that I do that. And at that time I succumbed. I felt, well, yes, this is definitely something I ought to do. So I went, and I was initiated by the leader of the TM in Turkey, Albert Baruch, a transcendental meditation teacher who came and brought meditation to Uzbekistan together with his wife. So I was initiated into TM and practiced it for 5 years without missing one sitting, morning and evening. For 5 years, this was my personal therapy. And of course, gradually these years coincided with that not so sudden, but definitely distinctive shift away from everything that I have been worshipped prior to that. What I mean by is the values of Western culture, from the ancient Greeks through their philosophy to, let's say, the values of Western civilization. After all, that's the progression I made myself, being born in Central Asia, living in London, all the arts, all this, let's say, there's a tremendous reevaluation of that. Tremendous reevaluation. And I'm now becoming more and more and more drawn to all things Asian, Indian, Oriental, Eastern. I read ferociously. I study in different topics, subjects, and so of course, and all that reflects in my interest in art. I also study sacred geometry. Great interest in this, how to combine potential in different visual forms now. So of course, this now affects all spheres of my creative life as well. And one way or another, all this comes to a point when in my mid-30s, I kind of faced with whatever that may be called existential crisis or what have you not. And this may be surprising for listeners because my life at the time was absolutely dream come true of any artist. I have a studio just off Abbey Road in St. John's Wood, professional artist, 2-level studio with enormously high ceiling and a mezzanine and a skylight, a dream in the area where artists don't usually have studios, you know. This is all converted by estate, you know, by the property estate. So I'm making a living completely. I don't even need to have a dealer anymore. I used to have a dealer, and like I'm like selling from my studio. I run my own exhibitions. I have whole, let's say, network. I have few patrons who buy from me enough for me to live a very comfortable life in London. And there's nothing to complain. So where's this existential crisis supposed to come from? And yet, of course, by that time, the build-up of unknown to me, sort of heart-based feeling of what is it all about? What's this life all about? What, you know, the classical, the canonical way of what this is all about. You know, of course, from just reading the philosophy, from just reading the Bhagavad Gita, and also dabbing into all the mystical verses and poems, and this is all fuels that longing, and longing gets more and more. It's this build up of that longing. And around that very same time, I meet this girl. I fall in love madly, and at the time I feel that this is what is lacking in my life somehow. This is where all the projection of my longing is going to go. So it's like literally in mid-30s, I suddenly found myself totally head over heels, right? Heels over head, whichever way you want to put it, madly in love, but it is unrequited love. And for me, being this Mr. what have you, I feel very, very smitten, because there's this maybe not outright rejection, but simply not requited. There's no reciprocation. And I remember there was this one particular encounter in Hyde Park. I was with this person, and I realized that, you know, like there's something is not working. You know, there was this kind of a encounter where I feel that all this, and how I feel it, I have no idea. Simply like this realization that it's an enormous projection of something that I am carrying within myself on this person. And that is way overwhelming. Not only that she's younger than me, like some 10 plus years, and have 0 point of reference to the experiences I went through. After all, by my mid-30s, I could have lived already at least 2 lives with all that happened prior to that. There was this, you know. So I get up and I just start walking. And from Hyde Park, I walked all the way home, right, through Edgware Road, all the way to St. John's Wood. And as I'm walking, this realization grows in me stronger and stronger. And it's like curving and falling back onto myself. All that enormity of that heart-based feeling is now returns and floods me with that extraordinary experience of what may be called self-love. I'm not going to insist here, because obviously I'm speaking in retrospect, but it's accompanied by this sudden realization that it is a projection, and in fact what I'm experiencing is the tremendous swelling within my own heart. And it's so that kind of like the out there person, when I consciously make this decision that there's no need for it to be reacquainted, it's enough to have that experience, floods me with that love, bliss, And yes, it is also accompanied by the melancholy and certain, like, let's say, bittersweetness of that experience. That as I'm walking, all this is literally, by the time I reached and put the keys into my door, I felt life is about to undergo a profound change. And at that time, I'm deciding to enroll into this TM-Sidhi course, which is being called now, and they doing the formation of that group again in my home country of Uzbekistan. And these 4 long months of waiting as the course is being postponed and postponed again, I'm like waiting for that time and managing to put all that, let's say, energy into the creation of a new series of works of art. I'm like now experimenting with very different media. I'm just deliberately going on works on paper, pastel. I'm throwing an exhibition there, knowing that it's almost like I'm wrapping something up. Some tremendous area of my life is about to be completed, and it feels that way. So it's September. This exhibition, enormous success. It's just like, overnight. Like, again, just to carry on in that same vein. And yet none of that financial success, none of that, adoration, adulation, whatever, it feels like someone else's dream. I'm already in a different realm. I'm in a different dimension. Something else matters much more. And so by the time I finally go to Uzbekistan and the course begins, I'm entering this phase where I have to sit at the back of the room because my body goes through these continuous vibrations. I'm sitting on a chair and the chair just like hits against the floor because of the frequency is so high. I have to sit at the back of the room not to disturb anyone. So the first 2 weeks is the theoretical part, right? We're learning the sutras. The TM-Sidhi course, for those who don't know, is based on Patanjali Sutras that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, whom by that time I acknowledge as my spiritual guide and with a tremendous degree of admiration, but none of that devotion that yet to come. And as the course progresses and then goes into the second phase on the mats now for the remaining weeks to try out the sutras, and this is when all that unleashed and, effectively speaking, the whole process began there and then. So when I came back another month after that to London, when I returned to London, I returned literally as a different consciousness. Like I walked past the same streets, houses, trees and buildings. I walked into my studio and I looked at everything, including my own works of art, as if someone else had done it. There was this tremendous reorganization. Of course, I don't want to confuse anyone. This is not yet the complete rewiring. This is yet to come. But the shift has taken place. And so the process mercilessly proceeds from there on. As it was already initiated during the TM-Sidhi program in Uzbekistan, where it went like into stratosphere. By the end of the course, I was like, I barely was able to put my attention on any task because there was so much bliss, there was so much that I could just sit all day and just vibrate. And yet, of course, I was still doing these programs. And whenever I would try to put my attention on something that requires this mental, let's say, activity, it will be very, very difficult. So And at that time, of course, I thought, well, this is okay. It will pass. It will just stop. Okay, just maybe another week, 2, I'll be back to normal. After all, I've seen these people who went through the course, right? I've met these people already in London and in other parts of the world, right? I knew the community, the TM community. I just was waiting until all that, let's say, fireworks and all that dust settles. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. So maybe I pause here. So this returned to London in January 2002. After the course was in 2001. In January 2002, there was this sweeping movement when within 3 days, what I've then learned post factum was the full ascent of Kundalini as it is known classically, literally. So this, I have spoken, I have written about this on various occasions. It's very hard to define it in language in terms of what I mean by that, but I did that in my attempts in the first interview with Ricardo for the Buddha, the Gas Pump, in my interview for Conscious TV, going back how far back, I think 2012, these interviews took place when I talked about it. But effectively speaking, the entire whatever sense of being and everything with all its faculties was withdrawn with one tremendous forceful sweep right into the higher chakras. And after, let's say, some very unusual, again, later clarified through scriptures and spiritual autobiographies, events took place until literally it felt as if that what was experienced as internal light, because already all these experiences were the internal, let's say, outpouring, was withdrawn into pure sense of what I cannot define, but it felt as if I am giving birth to that light. In other words, the whole manifestation was issued and with tremendous force out of my own being, not being as a human form, not being as a human form, wherever that, let's say, I found myself in that moment in time, which is also, interestingly enough, coincided with me just temporarily staying at the house sitting whilst a friend was away, and I was transiting between my own, like changing the houses, changing the place. When I got up and some body consciousness was regained, it was in the middle of the night. I walk outside. It's January. I walk outside, literally, I don't know, I was barefooted or I was wearing my PJs, and I just go straight to that hotel in Swiss Cottage. There's this whole housing estate there, right next to the Swiss Cottage Hotel. And I go there inside, because I can see this, like, there's some activity, and all this is accompanied by tremendous sound as well. Tremendous sound that is coming seemingly from everywhere. And of course, people at the desk seeing me screening and like, sir, how can I help you? This and that. And it's all kind of happens as if in a daydream or in a dream. So what I maybe wanted to know if there's some kind of interaction, but not sensing that people are being a bit concerned, maybe the way I look. So I apologized, I walked out, and I just wondered. I just had that, there was this propensity to just wonder a little bit. And came back to the inside the house. And this, I don't know, I don't recall if I ate or slept for 3 days. There was no memory of any physical like activity of being thirsty or being hungry or being anything. It was just literally walking as that humming sound and light. But the body had to move. That's what I remember distinctively. It didn't want to just sit as it would be in meditation. And from there on, of course, when that subsided, when I kind of regained that body consciousness, again, fully, I've realized that something so profound happened that not only my life will never be the same, it is no longer my life. So the reference point shifted completely and utterly. And so from that point on, 2 years of intense sadhana proceeded, comprising in total another full 5 years. But the 2 years were very, very distinctive because this is all the integral yoga began to display itself. That whole integral yoga, with all the spontaneous movements, with all the spontaneous involuntary pranayamas, and all that what is known and for what it is known. So maybe I'll put a pause here so not to turn it into a biographical conversation.
Thank you, Igor. That's you just shared a lot. So I just want to maybe frame your awakening so I can refer to it perhaps when we discuss Kundalini and other concepts around it. So you had an initial, you said you're initially when you were suffering from some kind of displacement, you had your first experience where you sat up in bed, and subsequently from then over a number of years, you had more and more experiences when then in London, you had this, as you might describe it, the full awakening experience. Is that correct?
Yes.
How many years in that period from the first one to the time in London?
Well, that's easily that. Let's see, if this was approximately in 2000, well, maybe period of 7 years, 7 or 8 years.
And I've got a couple of follow-on questions, but I first want to ask you, in that period, did you come across the term Kundalini? And did you know it was you were going through this?
Okay, that's interesting because already I was in the company of people who were very seriously into yoga, primarily because I've met someone with whom I was, became involved romantically, and we became a very, very close friends. A person who was an accomplished yoga teacher in her own right. And she introduced me there and then to that whole community of yoga teachers, right? So this was my first experience in the yoga ashram, primarily yoga known as Shivananda yoga, and then also some people from Kripalu yoga. And in London, I've met people from also the Iyengar yoga. So of course, all these were postural yoga. All this, we're still talking about the 90s, where yoga made its way to England, where it was already very popular in the United States. And so the term Kundalini has transpired in some conversations, but I didn't pay attention to it at all. To me, it was all kind of more of like, frankly speaking, more like it's a great therapy to enhance one's life. To me, all this was like all these postures, bending, and even meditation itself is just to make life, to ward off the accumulation of, just awash yourself from the accumulation of stress, right? Balancing the nervous system. So there was, I would say, even not so much the deeply spiritual element that only presented itself much later. So in those years, it was like a greatly working therapy. And so the term Kundalini only for the first time made sense when I was in the TM-Sidhi course And when all these experiences that I went through, or rather have begin to manifest, there were people in that surrounding who went through these courses and experienced it to whatever degree. And for the first time, there was this one particular person was telling me, this is Kundalini, man. This is like Kundalini. And I had no idea what he's talking about. I said, okay, Kundalini, so what? Right? Prior to that, I haven't read anything specifically about Kundalini, except, yes, I had this Thames and Hudson publication by, I might even have it somewhere in my books today, but this was more like a artful publication, something from Indian culture, just like Thames and Hudson had on yantras, on on tantra, right? It was just one slim book on Kundalini. You flick through the diagrams, right? These drawings and this kind of like various different colorful illustrations, but nothing really in terms of what it is. So of course, when going through these experiences, when I was back in London, I had to go and find out. And at that point, the education began. Education of understanding, because there was no internet. I didn't even know computer. There was internet. This is 2002. But I was not at all in any way into it. So I don't even think I even had an email account at the time. So everything would be from the books available. So I would go to Watkins bookstore and spend hours on end there to go through what might be helpful there. And it is when, after a couple of such visits and getting some books, like I went through some of the books by Gopi Krishna, and it just didn't feel strong enough. I felt yes, but it's just kind of like, this is not what I want to know. So I kept looking, and then there was this encounter when this book literally fell into my laps. It was Muktananda's Play of Consciousness. And of course, that book truly give in-depth explanations, including humbling, tremendous sense of humbling of what I've learned there. Because all this was completely analogous in many ways of what I was going through. Particularly the part, if I may, on nadas, these internal sounds, that in Muktananda's spiritual autobiography, he writes that the first time he experienced nada after 2 years of his Kundalini sadhana, whereas with me it was literally already began during the TM-Sidhi course. The nadas began to be and I went through all the different gradations of the sounds of nada, including the classically described, the sound of the flute, which was exactly how it is described in the scripture. Bewildering. I was always keen listener of music, always. Very, very diverse. My kids know at home how diverse, like it's known in the family. They never put shuffle daddy's collection, because you will end up in a total mess. You will have a classical Indian raga, followed by some heavy metal, followed by some shakuhachi flute. So it's very, very diverse interest in music, right? And yet, at that time, I could not listen to music, including the most refined Gandharva Ved sounds, which was already being TM meditated, of course, frequenting all these gatherings in the TM Center in London. I had a full collection, full 24-hour, by different performers, from sitar to bansuri flute to sarangi to vocals, all these different melodies of nature. Even that I didn't want to hear, because in carrying that sound, that internal sound, everything felt as disturbance. interference. Everything felt as if not refined enough. So that was very humbling. And the book, of course, this is where the Muktananda's influence was so important, because after about third book by Swami Muktananda, because then I started getting other books until I encountered that threshold, the Secret of the Siddhas by Swami Muktananda. And that was this introduction to Kashmir Śaivism. So this was a point of no return, because then I knew exactly that I have encountered something that is not only dear to my heart, understanding, but it gives literally the most precise, the most accurate conceptual framework of not only what I was experiencing and going through, but also perhaps more importantly, what was always innately known. So then, of course, from there was a phase of all the scriptures, all the most important scriptures available in English at the time. So there was like, in speaking metaphorically, I used to say I ate scriptures for breakfast, because there was this desire for knowledge. Scholars, of course, being introduced to these brilliant scholars of Tantric Śaivism, from Mark Duchkovsky to Andre Padua, very difficult, important books. It's not easy reading. It's not reading some kind of. It's a reading that requires constant dictionary of Sanskrit terms next to you. Like it's written by scholars for scholars, not for a lay reader like myself. But because what I was going through, it's this whole world opened up. There was insight and understanding. I also used to give this example to my own students years ago. I read Bhagavad Gita for 5 years, verse by verse, for 5 years, in Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's translations and interpretations. And yet, upon that, let's say, main event, when I picked up the Bhagavad Gita and started rereading it, every single verse was revealing the essence of what the verse is communicating, but in a totally different light. It's as if I somehow failed to see it before, or as if intellectually I would understand what is being said, but it was not accompanied by the cognition of that what is pure gnosis here, see? So that's why I was able to read, I guess, the scriptures which written by scholars for scholars. And of course, all the translations by Jaidev Singh, brilliant, scholar and contributor to the studies of Kashmir Śaivism, who has translated some of the most immediate, let's say, scriptures from Shiva Sutras to Vijnana Bhairava Tantra to the Spandakarikas and so on. So there was this, very, I still have them on the top shelf of my library, all published by Bonatinal Banarsidass, this Bonatinal Banarsidass. It's the Indian publishing house based in Benares, which carries out this very important task of dissemination of this knowledge. So this is now kind of no longer keeping with any, not so much keeping with the trajectory or the sequential unfoldment of what I spoke prior to that. This was all happening and also simultaneously. I'm amidst of this process. I'm in my sadhana. My whole entire life is reorganized. I'm not working. I'm not producing anything. I'm not painting. I'm not even selling. And yet life is organized in such a way. I just recently spoke about it with Jacob Cale, who interviewed me just last week, that I was trying to convey this, that life somehow organized itself in such a way that I was able to do my sadhana in London, because I couldn't physically even leave London. People were asking me, why don't you just like go somewhere? Where, what, how? There was no network, no internet to go and Google, oh, which ashram can I check in myself, or all by word of mouth. And somehow intuitively, I felt like, well, no, this requires adjustment. For the first 2 years, I was actually waiting when there will be this natural unfoldment and the propensity to go back to art making. That is, yes, very, very interesting. I even had it like I would rent a place. I rent a place in Elsley Terrace, just like a shorter street at the entrance to Primrose Hill. Beautiful. My neighbor was Kate Winslet. She was with Sam Mendes at the time, still with a little girl, her baby. Like it's an exclusive address, right? Jude Law would walk his kid in Primrose Hill on that side where I lived, because it's away from all the hustle bustle of the other side of the hill, where the Primrose Road. And I am like, to me, it's all irrelevant. To me, it's like all this, like it's a world that I've lived and left behind. I'm in my sadhana. I walk around like a madman, like literally long hair, beard, like, I do my grocery, I go to the shop, and I can see people look at me, and they look at me because I must be looking something else. There's like, I don't know, maybe there was this absence in my eyes, or maybe this, because there was this phase when I was literally, even the skin was glowing. And that's not quite emaciated yogi, lost a lot of weight, and was literally, when during the phase of pranayama, I could not eat solids much, and there was no desire. There was aversion to solid foods. I was on fluids. For some time, I was on milk and ghee and honey only. Like a bowl of milk, that will be my meal. Then I start like this, as the spring I remember came, I would buy these seasonal mangoes from India and Pakistan and local shops, and have chapati with ghee and mango. That will be my meal. Because anything else I would eat, then when I sit down and the pranayama starts, I would feel how the internal network of nadis have to work harder. You see, so that also we can speak about it if you'd like, of that rise of the spontaneous nature of guidance that was there, because I did not have a privilege of having teacher next to me, and access to, of course, like TM teachers. I don't want to make any kind of passing statements that may be misinterpreted here. So, but TM teachers could not relate to that. So whoever I went to see in the TM Center in London, it was just like some of them were, well, you must be doing something wrong. You see, I've tried to do group programs because I was allowed to. The TM-Sidhi programs, like hopping on the mats, right? That's what TM-Sidhi is known for. So after a couple of these occurrences there, when I went all over the place, like literally, like before any sutras, before anyone hopping, I'm already hopping, bouncing like a ball. Until one teacher lost it and grabbed me and tried to restrain me and hold me down, only to be catapulted several meters away from the power that he tried to contain, without me doing anything. It's just, and I realized I'm better off not to. So, and of course, I could not receive guidance from Maharishi himself, although I knew people very high up in the movement. So one such person who was very dear to me at the time, Susan Hamza family, from Lebanon. Amar Hamza was and property division. They were both initiated by Maharishi in the 60s. And Susan was the same age as like my mother, and she kind of took me under her wing, and she would invite me to her place, they had beautiful apartment in Belgravia, where they will have either Guru Purnimas or Maharishi's transmissions on his birthday on the 12th of January. And I would go, and there would be small group of people. So when Susan was the first with whom I actually spoke and related my experiences, I didn't relate it to anyone, even to my closest friends, because I somehow knew there will be misunderstanding. Whenever I tried, there was this, like, something is wrong with me. And people were coming genuinely from concerns, from care. But obviously now I have the understanding to see why they would not understand. So at the time it felt just like all the boundaries, with the boundaries of my individual life, all that what was also as the part and parcel, right, of these connections were crumbling as well. Friendships, associations, you see, because not many people can relate to that. And when I related this to Susan, she just told me, "Right, Maharishi, you're right. I knew his secretary, I will pass it on to him." So I wrote this letter by hand. It took me a long time to choose the right paper and everything. And it was passed on to Maharishi. So anyway, without that immediate guidance and without anything being available at the time other than hearsay, what was passed on by word of mouth or published in books, right? I was blessed, I would say, from being exempted or saved from all the unnecessary, let's say, or potentially undesirable influences that some such guidance could result in. So I've realized that what is happening here right now ought to generate that internal guidance, providing I'm constantly aligning myself with the best, with the truth, with the utmost. And of course, the scriptures were serving as such. So scholars who worth their salt were serving as such. And in my own sadhana, of course, there was this break into the phase known as rise of that spontaneous guidance, which is pure intuition. Pratibha, Sanskrit term. When that intuition is not based on logic, it's not based on dichotomy of thought, it's a pure insight, and I would just follow that insight down to the minute guidance inside sitting of what to do, what not to do, where the leg goes here, where the arm goes, how the body stretches. That constant hearing, listening, tuning into this of what by then was already utterly and entirely integral yoga unfolding within itself for its own sake. So of course, even with that, there's always like, okay, so body wants to move this way. Making sure it's not that somehow I feel like, okay, let me move this way because maybe this is good. See? No, I'm neutral here. I'm absent. Let the body move by itself. And the body just does. Let me rub my sweat back into here. Let me stretch this way. Let me completely undress and be naked, or let me wrap myself up. And so it goes, you see? Let me stand up and stand on my feet, or let me lie down. It's like all was like that. Completely. The mind was just learned to totally and utterly surrender and subdue and take a second, I would say, give up the driving wheel.
I have a question, but before I do, Alan, do you want me to go, or do you have a question?
No, I mean, that's a fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing so much, Igor. It's a fascinating journey. I'm probably jumping ahead here, but I find myself, it's a topic that I'm not familiar with, but you're being drawn to the Kashmir Śaivism, and what like that tradition shines. There's a particular angle that tradition has on understanding Kundalini. So I might be jumping ahead a bit there, but I find myself thinking, where has this? So you've been taken towards that path, and then this, the very detailed intellectual examination as well as this path. So I'd be interested to hear so how your understanding of Kundalini developed, basically.
So maybe it would be important first to make this distinction. And I think this distinction is crucial because this is how I work in my own, let's say, practice, and let's say how facilitators are trained in our work. So it's not so much about Kundalini per se, you see, not so much about Kundalini as a Kundalini, what is Kundalini, but it's very quickly dawned on me that there is Kundalini as it is referred to with regard to certain psychophysiological processes, how it is known and how it is somehow entered the language of the New Age in its various different domains, and Kundalini as the loftiest, highest concept in the Tantras. So before we go maybe into more intricate aspects of how that is and how in Kashmir Śaivism in particular Kundalini is viewed, which by the way predates all that, what served as the blueprint of how Kundalini understood and spoken in today's modern spiritual circles. Because most of these are coming from 15th or maybe 14th through 16th centuries, particularly through Shat Chakra Nirupana and Hatha Yoga Pradipika texts. The Shat Chakra Nirupana was introduced by pen name Arthur Avalon of Sir John Woodruff, who was the governor in India and purportedly was initiated into tantric practices, as he was also a Sanskritist and was fascinated with Indian culture truly. And he was, we could say, truly the very first Westerner. We don't know, maybe there were others, but certainly when it comes to English presence in the British Raj, that treated culture not as an invader or as a colonizer, but with the respect that it demands and commands. So of course, because of that respect, he was gained the access, and we might believe even initiation into the rites of passages of tantric practices. And the book is also here as a classic, right? What is it? I might even glance at here. Yeah, The Serpent Power. The Serpent Power by Arthur Avalon. At the end of that book, he reproduces the translation of that text, short text, Shat Chakra Nirupana, accompanied by these beautiful illustrations, starting with that whole silhouette of the figure with the chakras superimposed, and then each chakra beautifully drawn individually. We don't know whether these drawings were commissioned by Arthur Avalon, because they don't look like anything that can be taken from the manuscripts themselves. They don't have that pictorial look. Even the figure of the human figure doesn't look Indic enough, if you see what I mean. I can pull out this book just to show you, maybe, right? Like visually, literally, it's there. So this greatly influenced, of course, the understanding of the Kundalini, and then further, another text, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, that was also translated and also has been reproduced and published since with similar kind of diagrams and drawings. See? Whereas the concept of Kundalini that comes from the Shaivites is very different than that what was known in the later centuries. And so what the concept of Kundalini enjoys today mostly derives from these aforementioned two works, two texts. And with that, the kind of now being solidified understanding that Kundalini dwells at the base of the spine in Muladhara, whereas that does not correspond to how the Shaivites view this. Nor does it correspond to my own experiences or clinical experiences of some of the people who went through this, undoubtedly. Now I want to pause here and go back to what you have also asked just now. So maybe can you just remind me, Alan, please, just because I lost the thread now.
No, my question was quite a general question, really.
Yes,
I suppose, and it comes out of my own lack of knowledge of this subject, really, in the sense that I'm aware the Kashmir Śaivism perspective on Kundalini is unique.
Yes,
and
yes.
And you have started to explain that. So it's really just further expanding on that, really.
Yes. So okay, because that detour into these sources. So it quickly dawned on me that it's not so much about Kundalini per se, right? What Kundalini does or what it doesn't. But what struck me there and then, when I came across this understanding with which many of the sources communicated, that from the point of view of the Shaivites' philosophy, the very experience of being an individual is consciousness curves back onto itself in the moment of a repose. So the individual experience, this very, very experience of being human being, is Kundalini. Not that Kundalini dwells in the human being, as it is erroneously and continuously being expounded on and kind of no longer challenged and simply taken for granted. And this is where the misunderstanding is, because then Kundalini is reduced here into psychophysiological phenomena. And it is indeed, some people made this into their curriculum, into their work of speaking about Kundalini as such. You see? Even if Gopi Krishna spoke about it in his books, in his many, many books, as many as I think 16, that it's the greatest potential, is this and that, right? He was kind of giving this very novel at the time and noble attempts to give this Kundalini this view of next frontier and human evolution, kind of. it is still being spoken of as that power that is coiled within, at the base of the spine, within a human being. Whereas the perspective, if you hear now that I'm communicating, is in reverse. And the only other places that I found years after is spoken by Ramana Maharshi. That when Christopher Wallace interviewed me, which will be released soon on his podcast, as his podcast series, he read it back from my own book as one of his favorite passages, that paragraph where that very, very saying attributed to Ramana Maharshi on why do we speak of Kundalini as being inside. And he breaks this there and then, that it's neither on the inside or not outside. If anything, we are inside Kundalini. You see? Because Kundalini is not something that is located as some kind of, even if dormant power inside human being. This is an illusion or a misapprehension of the reality of the situation. And so, of course, when, as I mentioned in my own work, one of the very first protocol to follow when I was thrusted, something I didn't ask for, thrusted into working with people who have been going through various degrees and various phases of awakening back in the days. And I found myself, I have to quickly develop some kind of approach because all the cases had one similarity. Doesn't matter when it happened, doesn't matter when the report would be, but in majority of cases, awakening is improper, incomplete, or going through the wrong passages. Or if it's wholesome awakening, then there is accompanied by tremendous existential fear of one's losing it. See? Paradoxical, isn't it? So one of the first, let's say, rule of the thumb was to immediately communicate that it's not something moves inside of you, but rather consciousness moves within itself. And what is being experienced as symptomatology is simply the way we are wired as human beings and the way our nervous system functions here, which translates this into the variety of ways of how that phenomenon displays itself. Whereas, in fact, it's nothing personal. It's not happening even to a person. And that's the hardest thing to take. And yet, if one takes that, extraordinary transformation, ease up, and release of a very important here blockages begin. Because what one is confronted with is that what consciousness in the first place fancied itself as that coagulated, something crystallized into something what is being experienced as so and so. And when that understanding is now fully being lived through, get this adjustment, no, the other way around. If that is being adjusted, that understanding, one can live fully through that process because it's no longer seen as some kind of whether welcomed or alien-like process inside me. Kundalini is not a virus. Kundalini is not some kind of even energy moving inside human body. It is always the other way around. The true Kundalini process, or even Prāṇotthāna, of which we hopefully will speak, is in fact movement in consciousness. We can therefore conclude, and that's how it is referred to, the very experience of being human is awareness concealed to itself. So like, let's say if we are allowed to give that Shaivite language, Shiva forgoes all its omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and so forth qualities, so that multiplicity, diversity can take place. And each and every one of us is literally that vantage point. It's literally that point in consciousness where it can have experience of infinity through finite moment in time, measured by each and every breath. So this is a very different perspective. So human being, therefore, like Jiva is Shiva, right? Or Nara is Shiva, that very trinity of Shiva, Shakti, Nara, right? That very trinity after which the Tantric Śaivism carries its name, is the relationship of that triad of seer, seeing, and seen. The relationship, the triad of the knower, means of knowledge, and known, or subject, experiencing object. So subject and object are not different, they're not different entities. They are modalities of awareness. So Shiva conceals its essence in creation. This is the philosophy, this is the beauty of the metaphysics. But how is it all carried out? That's the property of Kundalini. And therefore, in the book, I made it into my business to go and into this most loftiest concept of three Kundalinis, Para, Chit, and Prana Kundalini. And making sure that what was given and outlines by another very important Kashmir Shaiva scholar of the time, Lillian Silburn, presented in her book, but in very cryptic, often inaccessible language, energy of the depth. So this is in the introduction already. I give that attempts to already orient the reader. This is what we will be dealing here with. So you see, this reverse perspective is very important because otherwise we are continuing that kind of erroneous interpretation of Kundalini process as some kind of internal into the human being, inside the human being. This is perception born of ignorance. Because of the perplexing nature of our experience, because all we can have, all we can report, all we can write home is a somatic or psychosomatic nature of what, effectively speaking, is the humming resonance of that movement. So whenever consciousness moves, we can even speak about Kundalini in pure terms of what it means, like as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi back in his days was saying before the language was moved to a much more oriented towards scientific language, accessible and convincible for the Westerners. In the earlier years when he taught still in India, when someone asked about Kundalini, Kundalini is your own consciousness. The degree to which consciousness alive to itself is the degree to which Kundalini is active. So that's all there is. So, not sure if this fully answers that, but the reason, rather now to give that more of a summary, to me, don't forget that also quality in the metaphysics of the Tantric Śaivism was very dear as an artist as well, because of the positioning that it communicates from get-going, that the creation itself is not seen as an oxymoron, byproduct, or a sheer accident, or appearance in Brahman. Like if you read Vashishta Yoga, right, one of the primary scriptures on the Advaita Vedanta, or the Brahma Sutras, or Ashtavakra Gita, or many of these, let's say, Advaitic Vedantic scriptures. In the Vashishta Yoga in particular, there's an example constantly given that the appearance of this world is just as the crow flows over the palm tree and the coconut falls down at the very same time. There's no connection. It just seems there is. See? Whereas, or the rope and the snake, right? Rope and the snake, the Vedantic analogy. Whereas in Kashmir Śaivism, the world is seen from a positivistic perspective, not as an appearance in consciousness, but as the embodiment of Śiva. So, of course, to me, this was extremely appealing as an artist. And this is I try to communicate as in my very first book, which was consciously done as the first book, Camatkāra, The Hidden Path, published 2 years ago, because that book, literally, I felt, so the transition from being an artist, which is a very important part of my life, to spiritual teacher had to be communicated in this way. And Camatkāra is that very, very unique concept to Shaivite philosophy, particularly expounded by 10th century sage Abhinavagupta, and as aesthetic astonishment, Camatkāra, that sense of Camatkāra, who also safeguarded the Indian drama by introducing the 9th rasa into the theory of rasas, Rasavada, right? So the Bharata's scripture, Nitya Shastra, deals with 8 rasas, and there comes Abhinavagupta and gives his gloss and brings very important 9th, Shanta rasa, and enriches Indian culture, philosophy, and civilization there and then by safeguarding the arts. I give this very important analogy there in that slim book like this, Camatkāra, and the comparative analysis of someone like Adi Shankara, 8th century sage, and Abhinavagupta. If you have artistic predispositions, creative predispositions, and you happen to be somehow exposed or drawn to the teachings of Adi Shankara, there's nothing for you. You might as well quit, because all seen as causal. Even artistic creativity is seen as causal. Maybe adjustments need to be made here. This is open to the polemics, because that may be not the late Adi Shankara. But at least the classical Adi Shankara is so. Whereas in Abhinavagupta, creativity is the very property of Śiva. So every artist is given that. If you have predisposition to write poetry, dance, create music, write, paint, right? Express yourself, create. You have the ground to stand with Abhinavagupta. With Adi Shankara, the ground is pulled beneath your feet, you see? So that is indispensable from the way I've communicated that in the book. If I may do a plug-in, just joking, but just in the book, it was important for me that the book itself would have that quality of an art object, the way it is produced, the way it is laid out throughout, the way it is formatted, and above all else, the way it is composed. It's not at all neither a manual, no purely scholarly exposition. It is a rather, even as the subtitle itself, the goddess as the power of self-recognition in Shaivism. It was very important to me to give Kundalini its treatment as the goddess. You see, so when you're asking me this is maybe the summarizing notes on, it's not about, oh, now I can pinpoint what Kundalini is. That itself is a futile exercise. Whereas Kundalini, spoken by Shaivites, is a goddess in her different manifestations. And she is therefore venerated as such. Whereas in a lot of contemporary conversations, Kundalini is reduced to psychosomatic symptomatology, if you see what I mean. So this is what I wanted to redress with this particular work.
So Igor, there's a really important question we want to talk about, and please give your time to answer this. The definition of Prāṇotthāna, what it is as opposed to Kundalini awakening, and why maybe people are getting confused between these two different types of experiences and how they're linked.
So first of all, this is really the crux of the matter, because the Kundalini not only has become a buzzword, but there are a lot of misunderstanding on the very nature of the Kundalini process, as now it is circulating in the social media as something that one can acquire in a weekend, taking a course, or just some kind of enhancement to one's life. And so this is maybe the most significant adjustment we can make. So the Kundalini process proper and Prāṇotthāna, which is a Sanskrit term for heightened pranic activity, they at the face value display a lot of similar aspects, almost in some ways identical in terms of its psychosomatic manifestations. The bodily movements, spontaneous yoga asanas, mudras, changes in breath, different spontaneous pranayamas, glossolalia, vocalizations, right, overtoning, speaking in tongues, various different kind of symptomatology for which Kundalini process is known. And the same can be experienced in Prāṇotthāna. However, the main distinction is that Prāṇotthāna does not lead to the shift or the axis of perception of one's self. So in other words, it is being experienced by individual, and it is the individual who ends these experiences or undergoes these experiences. And there's no shift. There's no radical shift in perception. Whereas Kundalini proper process leads to complete and utter rerouting of that. So it's literally a transformation of human consciousness, where one viscerally goes through the process where that notion of human being undergoes radical change. We will speak in a moment how does that look from the clinical point of view with the help of the neuroscience. But going back to the Prāṇotthāna and all the cases most of the cases that are being reported today or spoken about is, of course, not to be also discarded as something insignificant or second best. This is also will be an erroneous assumption to somehow underplay that. Prāṇotthāna, in fact, is an extraordinary way of the capacity for self-healing at the root level, at the causal level. So all these activities that are initiated and all that process that is experienced by so-and-so is in fact the healing at the deepest level. So, and of course, there are different degrees to and different intensity to that process. Just as in Kundalini classically spoken, it can be gradual, intermediate, and violent. Violent here meaning intense. Just simply tradition speaks of it as violent. In the same way, Prāṇotthāna can also display itself as being gradual, right, mild, and intermediate, and extreme, intense. And perhaps those intense phases of Prāṇotthāna are most often being mistaken for Kundalini, because people then, under the assumption that they are experiencing the true Kundalini awakening and rising. Where the difference here, as has been noted above just now, is that it doesn't render the individual. It happens to the individual, and therefore, in my own practice, when people report back, those who have the propensity to know it better, those who are still driven by some internal, let's say, insights and intuition, they want to have greater clarity. And so they do bring these inquiries out into the open. How come I went through this for that many years, this and that happened to me, but I'm still this person? Nothing changed in me. My consciousness is the same. In fact, in many cases, I have this, and this and that should have been completely altered. And that's because it's not Kundalini process. It is the process of heightened pranic activity, which also is seen traditionally as a prerequisite for a Kundalini proper. And here is perhaps the most important and significant part, is that Prāṇotthāna process still facilitates the purging of the subtle pathways of energy. So in that respect, it's identical to Kundalini process, but it falls short to what Kundalini brings about, and only Kundalini can bring about, and that is the higher activities in the cortexes, where a radical unplugging taking place, where synaptic circuits are disrupted. This only happens when Kundalini is going through its full ascent. Why that is has been already alluded in our previous conversation, that if we understand Kundalini being the result of this experience of being so and so, then that will become apparent. So in other words, it is Kundalini as the power, as the Shakti, that is responsible for all our experiences, for all our experiencing. It is what empowers everything, literally in the house. And most importantly, it's what gives the sense of this well-lived or not well-lived life, because that's what imbues us with the sense of being in the first place. So Kundalini, therefore, is that what gives rise to the individuality, and it is Kundalini that also alters that sense of individuality. So in Tantric in the language of the Shaivites, it is very clearly displayed in the dynamics of subject-object, or Śiva and Nara, Śiva in an individual. So awareness is hidden in the experience of being so-and-so. It is there, obviously, at all times. It doesn't come and go. This is where non-duality is correct as that continued pointer. But where it falls short is that non-duality does not configure, or has no Shakti configured in its curriculum. And it is Shakti that is responsible here in the first place for what we can call here forgetfulness. And it is Shakti responsible here for what we can call here as the process of remembrance. So remembrance here, or recognition, that recognition here is the property of Kundalini and Kundalini only. And that is the most distinct difference between the Kundalini process and the process of Prāṇotthāna. So that's, I would say, in a nutshell. And so that, yes, going back to that disruption of the synaptic circuit, what does it mean? The notion of the self, all of us carry, except, let's say, for the anomalies of which we can speak separately and address separately as anomalies, is a very subtle, very nuanced process of coming into the sense of self as we acquire it in the process of creating the synaptic connections. So literally, individual is not born, individual is the byproduct of that gradual coming into the sense of self. So it is an indispensable process of coming into that, what would become that individual. And in psychological terms, it's better to be a fully grown process. So in other words, this whole notion of the ego here constantly need to be re-examined, because the spiritual, let's say, job of homecoming, of becoming, is inseparable or open safely only to those who fully inhibit a healthy, well-developed ego. Ego here is indispensable. In Sanskrit term, it is exemplified by ahamkara, which is more precise. The English term ego, unfortunately, is way too pregnant with the connotations that coming and colored by the various schools of psychology, particularly clinical psychology. Whereas ahamkara is a sense of self or sense of individuation. It's one of the tattvas, one of the categories in manifestation. Together with buddhi as intellect and manas as mind, it forms antakarana, the inner organ, as in classical Indian philosophy. In the Shaivites, there is an additional chitti as memory and impressions, but principle is the same. Antakarana made of 3 or antakarana made of 4. It's just, let's say, more maybe precise in the curriculum of the umbrella that I use, where that presence of chitti as memory and impressions would form that inner organ. So ahamkara here is not just ego per se as egocentricity or lack of altruism, right? All forms of selfishness. These are psychological definitions. Ahamkara, in fact, is the healthy construct which allows the experience of this individuation fully. So ahamkara needs to be fully developed. And if it is deficient in any way, derealizations and depersonalizations are very often an outcome. So Kundalini and ahamkara, or rather the relationship between Kundalini and ahamkara in Indian tradition, internal, that is, understanding, is proverbial. Because ahamkara is the very, very final process of consciousness curving back onto itself, where it completes the process of individuation, where this experience is being savored by you or me so distinctly. It is I who see you now. It is I who have this tactile sense of here and now. Yes, of course, philosophically and esoterically speaking, this I here is the I of awareness, and awareness only. But at the very same time, this distinction that it is your experience in your time-space and in my time-space. If I catch a cold or if I experience pain, it doesn't mean that you are experiencing this at the very same time, even if you and I are one consciousness, one awareness. And that all is due to the ahamkara. Likewise, if I pass you my virus, whatever that is, right? It is due to some kind of functioning of your ahamkara that allows the immune system to lag or sluggish at a given moment in time for that disease to occur, of that illness, passing cold, whatever. This is at the level of, let's say, biological functioning. But of course, it doesn't stop there. It extends and goes into the deepest functioning of human being. The sense of self, the parameters of who you consider yourself to be, the very thought processes, ideas, all this what is guarding you and making you a lived expression of consciousness, as so and so, is all Kundalini. So therefore, that is the main distinction. And in the process of the disruption of these synaptic connections, there is a phase, depending on how much the circuits are disrupted, where one loses the framework or the parameters of that individuality. Thankfully, in a healthy functioning ahamkara, this will be only a phase and not a very prolonged one, because as it is visually, pictorially, graphically has been represented in the film like What the Bleep Do We Know, right? Remember that old classic? So the peptides are in that free form, waiting for making that synaptic connection, and that is accompanied by electrical impulses, which issues the hormones down into the body, into the biological, let's say, through the endocrine system. And likewise, the working of the endocrine system sends the impulse to repeat these connections. And so I call it the biological wheel of samsara in our work. But when these synaptic connections are disrupted, the sense of self is disrupted. And it is then reconstructed, you see? So the sense of self reconstructed. And that's the unique part in yoga. This is why you can make yourself into anything you want to a degree. And that's where the distinction also in how Kundalini has been approached in various traditions and lineages also differs. Thus, in the approaches of, let's say, that more of like a yoga tradition, where it is meant to be literally as extracting some formidable psychic powers, in the view of Tantric Śaivism, psychic powers are not important. By far, what is more important is that aesthetic quality that one lives with, that rapturous state of wonder. And for that reason, it is more suitable for householder. Whereas the more heroic path, or like virya, of the hatha yogis, require a renunciate way of life, because it's virtually impossible to combine it with the household activities. Because the goals are here different. And hence the approach to Kundalini is also different. So this is like maybe an addition on the differences between Prāṇotthāna as a process and Kundalini proper.
Thank you. Just to kind of fill in some gaps here, with Prāṇotthāna, if someone's displaying all these symptoms that are very similar to Kundalini, and they complete the balance, I guess when you describe Prāṇotthāna, you're still speaking about the balancing of Ida, the Prana and Ida and Pingala, or are you describing something different?
Well, I don't know what you mean by balancing of Ida and Pingala, because this is something that happens autonomously. It's a part of the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. So it takes care of itself, right? The breath oscillates between left or right, no, between solar or the lunar channels, respectively, throughout, independent on level of consciousness or spiritual advancement of individual, right? It takes place, it takes care of itself. It's the way we function. So, but if I maybe what you mean is that this classical yogic understanding of the balancing of the soul and the lunar as the subtle essences, right? Which, of course, here we would need to add fire, so that because they all come in three. So that the yoga is the yoga. Maybe the perspective in, again, if we are to lean on Tantric Śaivism, then the beauty here is that the relationship between seer, seeing, and seen at the metaphysical level is the relationship of fire, solar, and lunar energies. So the union of the seer, seeing, and seen that Vedic Samhita of Rishi Devata Chandas is the union of fire, solar, and lunar energies. So when the three fuse, that's unity. So when the fiery, the solar, and the lunar energies fuse, that's the fusion of the subject and object. So that is the experience of oneness, the true experience of unity. As far as the metaphysical understanding of the processes that Tantric Śaivism expounds on through this beautifully. So the balancing here, therefore, can be spoken of as that. But the Prāṇotthāna is the self-healing process. So Prāṇotthāna is a kind of embedded within the system mechanisms for self-repair. We can put it that way.
So I guess where I was getting to is self-repair as to what? Are we talking about a psychological trauma, physical trauma? What's the repair?
Everything, absolutely everything. Everything that impedes nervous system to vibrate with the original design of what nervous system here to represent. So anything that impedes us from this gift, greatest gift, right? Because so nervous system is an expression of all the laws of nature. That's what it is. That's what our spine is. That's really the human being, right? That the Vedic aham vedam, right? That Veda, human being is equivalent to knowledge, the sum total of law, universal laws, that anthropomorphic, right? That being. So every human being, therefore, in potentiality is that, is the totality of the entire universe as the place of macro and microcosm. And so in the image of Imago Dei, it's literally that. So it may be even more precisely, because in the image of, one can reduce this to the effigy. But a human being is not an effigy. A human being here is literally God made manifest. So this at least is a Vedic POV. And so anything that overloads nervous system one way or another, and what can overload nervous system? So we can just start counting on all our hands, and we'll not have enough hands to count what can contribute to that. From ancestral trauma to collective trauma that we experience now more than perhaps in any other point in time in history, to inability to process certain information, because experience itself is never so and so. Experience is the way we are processing the experience. So in other words, it is our capacity to assimilate experience into the fabric of our awareness. When our nervous system fails to assimilate this or that experience, by default, it lays as a stress. Or in psychological terms, those who are more kind of linked to that language, this would be moving or swept under the carpet into the domain of subconscious or unconscious. And that's where this whole concept of shadow and so forth. Why that is, and it's interesting, is because we cannot function at a conscious level if certain experience is unprocessed. And each of us now can relate to this directly, not hypothetically, directly. If we cannot deal with something right now, we don't have the capacity, be it coming from anything, any encounter, whatever that encounter is. Most obvious are human encounters, of course, human between humans. Mother-daughter, right? Husband-wife, right? Girlfriend-boyfriend, like the boss and the employee. Any encounter that there is that we cannot deal with, we do not have the capacity, cannot remain at the conscious level, because it will not make us able to function. Just think about something steers you, something triggers you. Biologically, there is a timing to that. You will be stopped being triggered maximum within 3 days' time. I will welcome everyone who now in the audience to strain the memory and see if you keep going about something after 3 days. Someone will protest. There's some people going after about it 10 days, 10 years down the line, but that's not the same. We can only be impressed by something, triggered by something for a certain duration. After that, another impression comes in, and already something else is playing itself out. This is, by the way, within the domain of the theory of rasas, or theory of emotive states, just as a footnote. So once it goes into the view of conscious, or what is not available to conscious level, by definition will no longer be available to it. It will be moved to deal later. Like you have this pile of papers, you can't have the time to look into that. I'll put it into this cupboard. I'll deal with it when I have the time, that kind of thing. So it goes into the subconscious or unconscious. And that's where stress germinates. That's where the impediment in the system begins to build up. And the subtlest form of all that, of course, is what clogs the subtle pathways of nadis, or the network of the subtle pathways of energy where prana itself circulates. So that, of course, is a totally different ballgame, because that's where the information accumulated from countless of incarnations is stored, because it's not down to physical. It is at the subtle level. It belongs to the domain of subtle body. So neuroscience doesn't go that further. It's just still trying to find its way. There's conversations on vagus nerve, this, that. But it doesn't go, it doesn't have, in the language, doesn't exist yet. Subtle body is only belongs to the domain of esoteric teachings of various different traditions.
So in trying to pin down this difference between Prāṇotthāna and Kundalini awakening for our audience who possibly are new to this information and this distinction, I'm trying to take symptoms they may be experiencing and make it applicable to these two different experiences. So just to be clear, many people who explore the kind of transformation through psychological and physical clearing, be it spontaneous mudra, spontaneous speaking, that can be attributed to Prāṇotthāna. Is that correct? Purely
Yes.
Yeah. And the Kundalini, and just so we're clear, that's more of a conscious, the reframing of the experience of consciousness, which is a different and maybe a post-Prāṇotthāna experience. Is that correct?
Well, as have been suggested, Prāṇotthāna is considered traditionally to be the prerequisite, even more desired way than going straight into the Kundalini process. Because going straight into the Kundalini process could even be and is dangerous. Dangerous, certainly undesirable, because we don't know what amount of information would begin to get released from the system, as in many awakenings is the case. So Prāṇotthāna, therefore, as a literally highest form of therapy available, the highest, most intelligent, because it is accompanied by the very same language that Kundalini speaks, that Kundalini is known for. So the whole gamut, the whole spectrum of display is in Prāṇotthāna almost identical. if we are to push to, let's say, well, what is the difference then psychosomatically, right? If we establish the difference is the shift in point of perception, and a radical one, then we could say that yes, Kundalini is more dramatic and more intense. Prāṇotthāna, even in its dramatic display, still manageable. People go to work, they do their jobs, they do whatever is required to be done. Kundalini can incapacitate someone completely, and it does so. So therefore, this is the very, let's say, distinction. So whenever there's some networks that kind of like, let alone movements like Kundalini yoga, is complete oxymoronic. Not only does it do justice, it confuses people. And because Kundalini, let's say, just make it, it's not a cherry on a cake of human existence. It's a complete and utter reevaluation of what human being is. So this is maybe where conversation should proceed with regard to very important adjustment that now starting to circulate so unabashedly, left, right, and center. People speak about it literally as a some kind of a fad, something to get, something to beget, something to just like to put behind one's belt. In addition to this and that, I also have Kundalini awakening. You see, it's like adding to, it's not a CV thing. It's something which crosses all CV altogether.
Can I just, again, to try to my mind to help clarify, would it be a fair summary to say that with Prāṇotthāna, it can be itself a profound process that can help the person to process perhaps their trauma, their social conditioning, and heal and be their authentic self? Whereas Kundalini can do all that if it's not been done before with the Prāṇotthāna, but the Kundalini sort of transforms the whole sense of self.
Yes.
Is that a fair summary?
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
Thank you.
very, very apt way of putting it.
So a subsequent question from that is that, as you've explained, Kundalini by its very nature can be a very traumatic process. I suppose less so if Prāṇotthāna has been done beforehand. But can Prāṇotthāna itself, I suppose you have sort of answered this by saying people can carry on working, but we're all aware of people who find themselves in a, for want of a better word, spiritual emergency. Can Prāṇotthāna also trigger a spiritual emergency?
Yes, very good distinction, and that requires us to revisit the relationship and the importance of ahamkara. So, yes, you've said it in a very succinct and concise way. Prāṇotthāna can do all that. It literally is that. Prāṇotthāna can be induced, transmitted, right? Prāṇotthāna can be the impact of the skillful Shaktipat. Prāṇotthāna can be self-initiated as a desperate attempt for self-healing. Desperate, I'm using here frivolously, as that self-preserving mechanism that kicks in here, so as not to let the system to completely calcify. So it brings greater fluidity. It melts the system. It melts what is crystallized. It is accompanied by heat as well. But what it doesn't do is does not assault the sense of self. The assault on ahamkara only can be done by Kundalini, because that is in the first place checked by Kundalini. And yet, it is very, very important distinction here. So are those people who have been going through various degrees of depersonalization and derealization, all going through Kundalini? Can Prāṇotthāna facilitate or initiate that? It can, if there is deficiency in that very sense of self, in the ahamkara itself. For example, someone in the phases of coming of age, in the phases of maturity, we can even determine exactly when that would happen. It would happen most likely at the point of when the child moves towards teenage years, in the time of puberty, when thyroid glands takes over, that first fall. Thyroid glands takes over, and from there on, hypophysis rules all growing processes, aging processes. This is the price we pay. This is the deal. This is the... At that time, if the sense of self somehow undergoes, let's say, assaults, whether within the setting, that could be family setting, or right? In other words, it's not conducive for the healthy development of the sense of self. It somehow suffers some kind of deficiency, right? Like, you know, you make this doodles, drawings, and right, you show it to your parents and they tear it off, right? You know, you tried something and you've done it wrong, right? And you are being clobbered instead of being supported, right? Praised, encouraged. All this goes into the small little things all go into that what will be a formation of the healthy sense of self. And in addition to that, there may be certain things inherited as well. That's ancestral, let's say. In my understanding, in the understanding of Vedic astrology also, which is also very helpful here, it is clearly can be even seen in a chart as well. That deficiency will be shown there, right? The deficiency, you can see even the weakness in the sun, right? In the moon, right? The mother and the father figures. In the Jupiter, the figure of preceptor, the figure of the guide, right? All this can be already indicative there, or afflicted Saturn in the chart. All this could lead to the impeded sense of self. And so to that person, if there is, let's say, dramatic unfoldment, and on top of that, they were exposed to all this, let's say, there's nobody at home, kind of nihilistic kind of teaching, ideology, then all combined will most likely create the possibility where system will go into that state of, effectively speaking, of freeze. You know, it will experience that numbness of depersonalization. As a response for that, you see, to that, what the process itself is initiated. And I feel myself in working with people, the exposure to the ideologies is so profoundly important. It's what we are fed in, literally. If it's life denying, then the propensity is much greater for being thrown on the side of the road, if not becoming a roadkill. Rather than someone who already has this life-affirming, you see, life-embracing qualities, which again can be seen in the chart as well. In the chart, right? Very strong, let's say, Mars, very strong planets that connects us to this, you know, to the more of this embodied realm, right? But if you are all over the place with moon, you know, there's like propensity to live in the mind, which is, by the way, very much among the spiritual folk is observed, right? Like kind of withdrawing into that very, very dreamy, imaginary kind of sphere. And all that coupled with the process that kicks in, then one can observe this, where that depersonalization will be here, even in Prāṇotthāna. It doesn't have to be Kundalini proper. Kundalini, on the other hand, has these two sides to it as well. We could say it's like the blade. On one hand, if it is accompanied by a very, very strong sense of self, you see, well developed, then it will translate and transform into discrimination. Tremendous sense of discrimination, discernment. That quality is so required. Is a prerequisite, in a way, in many, many spiritual teachings in itself. The sense of discernment is a requirement, prerequisite. Whilst if this is in deficiency, then the sense of complete and utter being lost to the process is much greater. And I have personally witnessed how people were thrown and never came back, unable to come back, particularly if it was accompanied by dabbing in consciousness-altering substances, which is often the case, by the way. Often the case. You cannot be underestimated the connection here of what Kundalini does, because Kundalini magnifies every tendency. So this is also, all these prerequisites here can be and must be spoken in terms of where that what is carried as the sum total of the present itself as a personality. Because Kundalini will magnify every quality, including the malignant qualities, including the negative qualities, at least throughout its phases, at least throughout the phases of ascent, even if this is going all according to so-called cosmic plan. You see, and we're not even now touching the deflecting or any kind of undesirable cases. We're just speaking about all goes proper. Even then, in the phases, that purging phase, particularly the first movement through the lower chakras, that's when there is possibility of getting obsessed with a lot of things that one would be just surprised to find oneself suddenly arrested at that stage, because of that propensity for magnifying every experience. In Indian tradition, it's often spoken of as literally Kundalini in a stage of teenager, as a teenager who is fascinated with everything for the very first time. So therefore, it's very important what you expose that newly awakened consciousness to, what connections would be made, where the attention goes. Environment, extremely important. The third part of the book on Kundalini deals precisely with this, the importance of these physiological, psychological, and environmental influences as the pillars to safeguard the process. So because of that very quality, it's literally as everything goes under the magnifying glass. So people prior to that did not even know, did not observe that in themselves, suddenly unable to do anything about it. Very, very, of course, one of the most widely known is the erotic phase that derails many seeker because it takes them to this phase of which is very difficult to navigate. Obsession with all things that is here in terms of its sexual expression, but it also can take form or combined with substances, being addicted to substances. Another side of being not addicted, but made being addicted to suppressant, painkillers, and all forms of, when people don't know and they want to kind of quickly deal with Kundalini, they suppress it medically, or they get mistreated. In 99%, I would say this figure is not exaggerated, of today's help in allopathic medicine. It is at the expense of suppressing, nothing else. There's nothing. How can you work with consciousness if there is no graph, no classification in the curriculum of medical studies? There's no Kundalini. See, this is what we've been speaking about it now into the third decade of the lack of that still. Those people who are unique, people who have been met in my early years in California, who were pioneers in a way in this, people like Stuart Savatsky, whom you're going to interview, right? And this whole board of the Associates of Transpersonal Psychology who work, as marriage counselors, other people I've met there, they all went through this Kundalini process. Not all of them, I mean, those I've met went through the process. And they combine it in their work, in their understanding. But if a person goes to someone who has no understanding of this, they'll very quickly be referred to psychiatric treatment, you see? So you go to psychology, to a shrink for help, and then they will refer you to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatric treatment is very well known. Maybe 1%, hopefully there is someone who will be just a black sheep or the white sheep, whatever you prefer, would stand out of that, and they will be like, okay, you know what? You need this and that. Don't look for help here. We cannot help you. At least that's honest.
Can I just ask you one last question about the Prāṇotthāna Kuṇḍalinī? When we talk about unity experiences, various levels of samadhi, I guess what you're saying, are you saying that these are more appropriate for the Kundalini experience? So people who have experiences of being both subjective, objective, observer, observed, experiences of oneness, where would these fit in within these different types of experiences?
Not necessarily so. So one can experience samadhi. I certainly experienced samadhi before the proper ascent. There was distinctive, undeniable sense of samadhi. But what also is a very, very distinctive language of Kundalini is that Kundalini sadhana is, effectively speaking, making samadhi spontaneous. So whereas there needs to be something, right? Certain conditions, quietude, seclusion, right? Like certain criteria need to be met. A proper meditative methodology to bypass, to let the mind, the lake of the mind settle, right? Before the samadhi ensues. And there are different samadhis, right? There are different classically spoken samadhis. There are 4 of them, 2 distinctive samadhis, others are on the way to samadhi, right? So in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, of course, it's a unique experience because this is a cessation of everything. And Savikalpa Samadhi is just as good, but it is accompanied still by some frequencies, some vibrations that are still even through sensory perception, they're available. Whereas in Kundalini, it's all becomes spontaneous. And the beauty of it is that Kundalini fuses Samadhi and makes it possible in the advanced stages. Advanced means integrative stages. Advanced simply means integral and integrative stages. Samadhi is experienced in the daily activity. That's the greatest, I would say now, to conclude this conversation, maybe at this point, greatest gift, because it makes the water water reaches all levels. Let's put it that way. It doesn't matter which side of the road you walk anymore. So going in and coming out loses its meaning. So this is why eventually even the most advanced meditators stop meditating, not as it is advised by non-dual teachers erroneously today, left, right, and center. Irresponsible, totally flamboyant, and wacky, I would say, suggestions that meditation keeps one tied to the sense of self and reinforcing that. That's nonsense. There's nothing that comes close to meditation that really creates this and prepares this. And I do not know how it all would have panned out if I did not have those years that what meditation did to prepare the nervous system for, let's say, the main event. Because there were these years of culturing of the nervous system, of going in and coming out, on a daily basis. I mean, I literally, I didn't want to miss one sitting for nothing in this world because it was so good. It was like that, like you sit down, few minutes, you go down, thoughts become transparent, abstract like clouds, and then boom, gone. Come out refreshed, beautiful, ready to function. No matter how jittering the day was, it's like the best massage. Nothing can touch it, no spa treatment. Are you kidding me? No, I swear by meditation. It's like, and in Kundalini, of course, that is fused. And so that experience of Samadhi is then becomes that what covetedly spoken of as Sahaja Samādhi. Samadhi with eyes open, Samadhi with going about your daily duty, Samadhi. It's like, because the functioning of the nervous system, that's all that, let's say, beauty of cognition that requires, right, that all the membranes to be open and function for the perception, is no longer obstruct or obscure the sense of transcendence that is experienced only prior to that in a sitting. And it no longer interferes as in the intermediate phases when you come out of meditation, and if you were in a deep samadhi, you need to kind of like, body-mind coordination is not there. You have to kind of like make sense out of it, like best not to do anything, like literally, like as they say, when you take certain medication, don't work with the machinery, don't do this, don't drive. Yes, in certain phases, driving is not advisable because the body-mind coordination is also out of whack. Whereas I'm touch wood, I'm an amazing driver, and I learned drive at the age of 42. My wife taught me. I never drove. I never had the need to drive. My wife taught me to drive all years after the Kundalini. And I cannot tell you, you drive, the car is extension of your body. And this analogy, of course, is very limiting and maybe very technical, but so this, in response to your question, that there is no, that we shouldn't draw the line here, because samadhi can be experienced and is experienced. So therefore, or maybe not therefore, because it's obvious that meditation is irreplaceable. But why that is, that samadhi is afforded as an experience? Why subject-object is appeased, even if Kundalini is not even moving? How is that possible? Well, the simplest explanation, because everything is Kundalini. Anyway, everything. It's all consciousness. Just different names that are given to it, just like Ramana Maharshi. When asked that, he said some call it Shakti, some call it Divine Mother. It's Atma, it's the Self. It's just different names for the same reality. So of course, there is no distinction at this level. So therefore, Kundalini, if we are to speak about it proper, awakens to itself, not to the individual. And that, of course, is a distinctive moment of realization where brings this and the great appeasement. It also brings this, all that, if prior to that one lived as individual with the point of entry and the point of departure, it becomes simply an event in consciousness. And one can very easily move between these two sides of the street without having to define or having to somehow make anything, let alone any effort. So this is why in the fully integrated phases, one functions in that role fully. At the end of the book, I was compelled to expand it with the two reflections, one called At the Edge of the Stage, and another one, The Song of a New Goddess, where I spoke from direct experience of how it is lived as as a householder, a family life, with all that where the rubber hits the road. So to make it tangibly relatable, so that there is this understanding that also that some people may be under the impression that Kundalini process will make them look like, or make them feel or look or this or that, they will be lost to human life. No, the quality of human life continues with an added value of knowing what that life is. So therefore, I love how Stuart Sawatsky frames it or words it. He talks about it as progressive maturation, soul maturation, progressive soul maturation. So it's like phases in human being. And if human being is cosmos, then Kundalini is that phase, very important phase of return. Return to the origin of what human being, or where human being comes in the first place from. So it is that conclusive return which happens at the level of consciousness, for the sake of consciousness.
And you're describing Sahaja Samādhi at this point, the end of the journey, the integration phase. We're living with Samadhi every day in a house as a householder. Is that what you're describing?
I don't know. Because yes, we can try to describe Sahaja Samādhi. But if I will say, well, yes, I'm describing Sahaja Samādhi, then that will be betraying the naturalness of the state. You see? It will be trying to qualitatively somehow pin it or frame it into something. Yes, there is a term. Sahaja Samādhi simply translates as spontaneous, sahaj, spontaneous, not induced, not result of, self-sufficient, self-arising, with reference to the self, self-referral. That's what sahaj means. So it is a natural state. It maybe feels unusual when it is being tapped into. There, then, oh, and one catches oneself. But when it becomes lived reality, then you don't know the difference. You don't have the analogous to compare it with. You don't have reference point left. Because the reference point itself, if prior to that existed, is now has been completely and utterly absorbed into consciousness itself. So what remains as a reference point is only consciousness. And consciousness doesn't have a reference point. Individual is not a reference point for consciousness. You see?
Are you also saying that Kundalini is consciousness? Is there any differential between consciousness and Kundalini? Is one being part of the other, or is it one?
None whatsoever, as far as my understanding goes. None whatsoever. We can use these terms interchangeably. And very often I advise people when they read about Kundalini, or like, why don't you replace this now with terms which will not be exotic, which will not be sort of outside of your culture? And often what consciousness, you see, or awareness, and see now, and often it helps. It really reduces the psychological tension of otherness, of some kind of exotic power that suddenly in me, Westerner, I have nothing to do with it. Why am I going through that? You know, I want to go back. I want my life back, you see? You cannot just whack people on the head by this life was never yours to begin with. So depends on the level of understanding. You start somewhere. You have to begin somewhere. So just that, these terms can be used interchangeably, completely.
I think maybe we should begin to wrap this up. Is there anything else you want to share before we go? Any other thoughts?
I'm good. I think we've touched up on quite a bit what you guys prepared. We wanted to place an emphasis and attention. And I would be open to any follow-up conversations that may arise. So perhaps we should leave that. Maybe your audiences would like to send some questions, requests, inquiries, and we can bounce off of those. So I'll just leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Alan?
Well, I mean, thank you so much. I mean, I will be reading your book with great interest, and thank you so much for your time and your insights. It's been fascinating.
So thanks a lot, Igor, and we look forward to speaking to you next time.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. It's a great privilege and pleasure to share, and thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to reconnect. Bye for now.